Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi man wala. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Allahumma zidna ilman wa amalan ya Rabbil alameen. My dear brothers and sisters in Islam, first of all, thank you for coming out. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make this evening beneficial for you. It's always a joy coming out to Brookfield other than my khutbahs. Although I'm wondering today if there's a wedding or something going on. We got some competition today, folks. But inshallah, we're going to make the most of our evening. And the topic we have today is a difficult one. There are a lot of kids in the crowd, so it is what it is. We're going to go, I'm not holding back. Obviously, it's not a graphic or gory conversation by any means, but definitely it's mentally demanding, but it's also very spiritually fulfilling. So you're going to see we're going to hit both notes today. Intellectual side, the emotional / spiritual side. And the topic today, of course, is the famous topic known as the problem of suffering. What the atheists call the immovable boulder. And they use this phrase because they think the theists, the believers in God, have no response for this. As we're going to learn today, we have some amazing responses. Inshallah, I'll share a lot of those responses with you today. But nevertheless, they're very cocky about it. They call it the immovable boulder. And I will, what they say, give the devil its due. I will confess this much, that this right here is probably the most formidable argument and objection that they have against religion, against God. And the reason is because it's a very emotional argument. And if you just think about the extent of human suffering, from the famines, to the genocides, to the brutal civil wars, to natural disasters and tsunamis and earthquakes. And then you think about what's happening in Gaza right now, where subhanAllah right now, there's more blood than drinkable water. And the children that are dying, and excruciating pain that people can get into, and the suffering of babies, and suffering in the animal kingdom. You put all that together and it overwhelms you. And if you're not careful and you're not fully spiritually grounded, it can actually make you lose husnul dhan of Allah. You start losing a good opinion of Allah. It makes you suspicious of God. And if you're not careful, it'll put you or push you towards a situation where you'll put God on trial. So, my dear brothers and sisters, how do we make sense of this problem of suffering? Let me tell you a little bit. I've been thinking about this problem, teaching about this problem for the last maybe a decade. SubhanAllah, I've given classes on this. I've given khutbahs on this. And today, inshallah, you get to see the most refined and inshallah the most sophisticated presentation I've put together so far. I've gotten it down to like 5 points. We might get through 4 today, inshallah, depending upon the time that we have. Really, I've boiled it down into simple phrases that you can memorize. You know my style. I like to keep it organized, and I like to keep it hopefully memorable for you. 4 to 5 phrases that inshallah are going to come up one at a time. And let me begin by stating the problem as clearly as I can. People who are confused by this problem, or atheists, they will say if God is all merciful and powerful, He's got these 2 attributes at the very least. He's powerful and merciful. Then why does He permit suffering? Why not step in and put an end to this madness? The suffering, the hardships, the afflictions that we see all around the world. Why not veto all this pointless pain? This is the question. And you can hopefully hear in this particular question of theirs that as human beings, and I think this is something we all know through a lived human experience, as human beings, we do see value in suffering. In fact, most of us are okay with what we call justified suffering. I'm sure you've heard of the phrase, no pain, no gain. And a lot of us appreciate that. In fact, we know that in our culture, and of course across the world, people actually seek out pain and suffering. So you may have heard of people who want to climb the Mount Everest. You know what a brutal experience that is? High altitude races, mountain biking, people seek out cold plunges, people go through the rigorous, painful, demanding martial arts training program. I'm sure you know what professional athletes have to go through, the type of torturous training that they subject themselves to. But that suffering doesn't really bother us. You know why? Because we see as human beings that suffering has a justifiable end. There's some value in the service of which that suffering is being done. What kills us is unjustified suffering. Suffering we don't see a purpose behind. We don't see the why. So I like to give an example. Imagine I'm sitting, I don't know, you're in the masjid and you see me for whatever reason. I'm in the conference room and I have a needle in my hand and I'm stabbing somebody, you know, and I'm poking somebody with this needle. You'd be outraged, like, what kind of imam is this? You'd be like, what is going on here? Is this, are we at the right place? Is this masjid or what? You'd be shocked. But if you just slightly change the context, imagine that this is physical therapy and there's a patient lying in front of me and I'm putting needles inside this patient at what they call the trigger points in their muscles and to loosen their muscle knots, also known as dry needling. It's also called cupping in one profession. Now I'm doing the same thing. I'm poking needles, but you're not outraged. Why? Because once again, you see a justifiable end. You see why it's occurred. So, my dear brothers and sisters, the point I'm trying to make is that human beings, we're okay with justified suffering. In fact, we seek it out. What gives us a big headache, a spiritual / intellectual headache, is unjustified suffering. And this right here is where I like to share with you my first point. Call it the first argument. And I like to state it like this. Let me come out and just say it. Atheists or people who are struggling with faith, they will say, why is God not stepping in and vetoing and stopping all this pointless suffering? We respond by saying, just because the suffering seems senseless doesn't mean it is senseless. And this is the first point you have to understand. Just because suffering seems to have no point to you doesn't mean it is ultimately pointless. Just because it seems unjustified to you doesn't make it ipso facto unjustified. You're actually making a leap from appearance to reality. And this right here is an assumption all atheists or people who struggle with faith make, that what their perspective on suffering is, they automatically assume it's the only way to look at that suffering. And because it doesn't make any sense to me, there can be no sense at all. But what if, from a more broader, zoomed out perspective, what if that suffering does have a justifiable end? You just don't know. Would it make sense to at least be open to that possibility? That's why in Ayatul Kursi, what does Allah say? وَلَا يُحِيطُونَ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنْ عِلْمِهِ إِلَّا بِمَا شَاءَ. They cannot encompass all of His knowledge except for what He allows. Implying that you and I have 2, 3, 4 degrees of knowledge. Allah has 360. And my dear brothers and sisters, if you understood this, allow me then to introduce one of the most important concepts I like to introduce today. You may have heard me talk about this before in khutbahs here and there, but today, very officially, I like to introduce this concept, and I hope this achieves some level of currency and circulation amongst y'all. I call this the principle of knowledge gap. Allow me to introduce what knowledge gap to y'all is. Knowledge gap is the idea that if there is a knowledge gap between you and an expert, where you know limited about a particular topic, you have what I call a low resolution understanding of something. Versus an expert who knows a lot more, way more, a lot more deeper knowledge, and they have an HD clarity or view on that knowledge. There's a knowledge gap between you two. If that's the case, it's possible that something will seem nonsensical to you from your limited vantage point and will seem completely sensible from someone who is an expert and from their point of view. I don't know if you guys were able to grasp that. Let me say that one more time. There's a knowledge gap on the scene. It's possible that someone who doesn't know a lot, they might see something as totally random and senseless, but from an expert's point of view, it's completely sensical. Allow me to give you a few examples to drill this concept home. Imagine you're at a busy airport, and if you're in the parking lot, you're going to notice something. You're going to see that airplanes are coming from all different directions, and from different altitudes, different directions, landing on different runways. From your point of view, it's complete randomness and haphazardness. You can't see any method to the madness at all. But you know that from an air traffic controller's point of view, it's a highly coordinated, sophisticated, planned process. But why does it seem random to you? Because there's a knowledge gap between you and the air traffic controller. You don't have the full breadth of what the air traffic controller knows, and therefore it seems senseless, random to you. This is the concept of knowledge gap. That it's possible that two people are looking at the same thing, and one will see it as random and chaotic, and the other will see it as sensical and patterned and ordered. You just have to be open to that possibility. Allow me to give you one more example, one of my favorite examples in this regard. In the 1990s, scientists, in the scientific community, there was a prevailing understanding of human DNA. And the prevailing understanding was that 95%, up to 95% of human DNA is what they called the junk DNA. Where at that time, with their limited knowledge, they looked at human DNA and they said, it's all useless, really leftovers from the evolution. Basically, as we were evolving from the monkeys, some of the DNA got left over. It's just spare DNA hanging around. Only 5% of DNA is useful, they said, which is used for coding proteins. Literally 15 years later, the Human Genome Project is completed. And the ENCODE project is completed. And now the very same scientists are like, oh, actually, pretty much all of the DNA has some function that we're slowly starting to discover now. With more knowledge, more zoomed out perspective, they're starting to see order and causes and patterns and organization. But with limited knowledge, it seems senseless to them. And my dear brothers and sisters, allow me to give one last example to help you understand the knowledge gaps. Because if you grasp this concept, you will have a very easy time understanding the rest of this presentation. One last example. Have you ever looked at rain data? If you were to look at rain data, you'll see that in Milwaukee, for instance, it rains few inches at this time of the year. In January, it rained this much, or will rain this much. In February, this much. And then Chicago, this much rain, few inches there, few inches there. If you look at rain data from your perspective, you don't see any order at all. You can't make the heads for the tails, as they say. But you know what Allah has to say about rain coming down from sky? He says, وَنَزَّلَ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ مَاءً بِقَدَرٍ فَأَنشَرْنَا بِهِ بَلْدَةً مَيْتًا. And we send down water from above in precise measure. Think about that for a second. In other words, from our point of view, rainfall amount seems rather random, but from a divine point of view, it's completely precise. Because Allah sees, with His complete vantage point, what you and I don't, just like the air traffic controller. So it's possible that something will not make sense to you, but it completely makes sense from an expert point of view. My dear brothers and sisters, if you understood this now, let's come to a moral issue. I gave you a lot of secular examples and mundane examples. Let's get to a moral issue now. One of the most painful things I ever had to do is when my wife and I, had to sleep train our child. Now, unfortunately, we took our sweet time, so apparently you're supposed to sleep train your child around the age of like 9 months. Make sure they're learning to put themselves to sleep so you can get your sleep back. Because let me tell you, if you're not sleeping properly at night, I don't know about y'all, my personality starts to change. So we did not sleep train until the age of 1.5. And in the month of Ramadan, we're going nuts because there's tarawih and there's suhoor. You can imagine the whole 9 yards. After Ramadan, we're like, you know what, that's enough. We love him to death, but we can't rock him to sleep no more. So we wanted to start sleep training him. Now I remember the first night. Folks, it took wallahi 2 hours of him crying at the top of his lungs, protesting, announcing to the world, why are you torturing me? Why aren't you here? And my wife and I, of course, my wife, she has the baby monitor, and she has for whatever reason, the kid is crying. You can hear it from the other room, but she still has a baby monitor right in front of her. So she has front row seat to his crying. And we suffered for 2 hours, and this kid cried and threw up a storm, protesting, why are you doing this to me? Why are you letting this suffering take place? From the point of view of this kid, unjustified. From a parent's point of view, completely justified. Why? There's a knowledge gap. We know more. And therefore, something may be morally sufficient and justified from our point of view, which will not be from that child's point of view. Let me give you another example. Those of you who have studied the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, you know Arabs had the custom at the time of the Prophet and before, that when their new child would be on the scene, after a few months, some say a few years, they would send their kids off to the rural areas. So the Prophet ﷺ, remember how Halima Sa'adiyya picked him up? Why did she pick him up? Because of this particular custom, that you would send your kids off at the age of about 1, some say even earlier. And now your kid is separated from you. Just think about that for a second. Just imagine the pain on that child, because I'm sure if you've observed children, you know the kind of anxiety they experience when mom is not on the scene, and how their biology just activates, and fear and fight and flight all just kicks in. Anywho, they would send their kid off to rural areas for months and years, separated. The child goes through a lot of suffering. I'm sure from that child's point of view, they're like, why are my parents leaving me and abandoning me? But from the point of view of the parents, why would they do that? Three reasons. One is that Arabic language was much more pure in the rural areas. Number two, city life had a lot of disease and rural areas were about a bit more pure. And the third thing was that their immune system somehow would get stronger because there were a variety of other reasons that they had, what they deemed as beneficial reasons, which would justify the suffering of that child being separated. Point I'm trying to make is that it's possible that from one angle something makes sense morally or is justified, it's morally sufficient. From another, it's not. And perhaps the last example I want to give, and then I want to move on. You guys know the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. If you were to zoom into his life, early on when he's being thrown down in the well, his own family conspires against him. And what makes the situation even worse is that when he's thrown down the well, the caravan that picks him up sells him in slavery. Man, if you were to just zoom into the pixel of his life and you don't have a full picture, you'd be like, what a poor kid. What a senseless world of suffering. Where is God in all of this? What does Allah say? Wallahu ghalibun ala amri. Allah was dominant over his affairs the whole time. Meaning Allah was facilitating his future greatness from the trials that he was going through right now. Nothing was random. Nothing was senseless from a divine POV, point of view. But from our limited, low resolution point of view, it may seem like, what the heck's going on here? Where is this headed? Why is this child going through all this? So, my dear brothers and sisters, what am I saying? The point that I'm making is that between us and Allah is a massive knowledge gap. And something might be morally justified from Allah's point of view, which may not really click with us, and that's okay, because we know through our own lived human experience that when you're dealing with an expert, they might deem something to be okay, you may not. And I'm just trying to make a rational case for intellectual humility. You know, in psychology, we have something known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, where the idea is that people who know very little tend to be the most confident. And this is something human beings actually suffer from. That when we have limited perspective, they say that about medical school students who are first starting out. In front of them is a 20-year experienced surgeon, and this hotshot coming out of Harvard thinks that he's got the whole thing figured out. Limited knowledge, inflated confidence. This is a human reality. So you want to make sure that you don't end up putting God on trial based on the limited knowledge you have, and now you're feeling all confident and you're emotionally charged about how this suffering is unjustified. Careful. From Allah's perspective, something may be justified that is not from yours. So we don't want to put God on trial. I'll drop one more analogy which I really, really like. One of the philosophers said that imagine a mouse separated from his parents early in life, put into a science lab, behind cage, suffers with his subjected to scientific experiments. There are needles, there's food deprivation. You know the kind of testing they do on rats in scientific labs for research purposes. Now these scientists are being humane. They're being as ethical as possible. They're not trying to hurt these animals, but they still have to do that research that they have to do. Now, that mouse, from his vantage, none of this makes sense at all. But from a scientist's point of view, all of it makes sense. In fact, it is morally justified. In fact, the knowledge gap between the two is so great that if that scientist even tried to communicate to this mouse somehow miraculously, he wouldn't be able to communicate because the paradigms are so different. Then the philosopher says the knowledge gap between you and Allah is greater than the knowledge gap between that scientist and that rat. So there's a case for intellectual humility that we need to make. And that's why in the Quran, when angels heard about the fact that Allah is creating human beings, what did they say? قَالُوا أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا مَنْ يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا وَيَسْفِكُ الدِّمَاءَ. Ya Allah, will you really put on earth a creature that's going to shed blood and create corruption and suffering? While we praise you tirelessly, what does Allah say? Allah invokes the knowledge gap. He says, I know about these human beings, but you don't know. You're going to have to trust me. If from my vantage point, it's morally justified. From yours, it's not. You're just going to have to trust. Now here, my dear brothers and sisters, so let me summarize so far what I've shared with you. Knowledge gap warrants humility. That's the first point that I've made so far. Now, when I share this with atheists or agnostics, I usually get a counter. Now, the reason I like to share this counter with you, because we want to go a layer or two deep. I don't want you to end up on social media and start dropping some of these phrases, and next thing you know, you get like destroyed. You know what I'm saying? We gotta go a layer too deep so you're properly armed. And forget about debating anybody. I want to make sure your heart is secure too. We get a, we usually get a counter here when we share this first particular argument that I shared with you. The atheist here will likely tell you. So what you're telling me is that even though you haven't given me a single reason why my kid died, or why that storm occurred, or why 3,000 people were killed here or there, you haven't given me a single compelling reason. But what you're instead telling me, that it all makes sense and it's all justified on the divine perspective. You're appealing to what they call the divine psychology. Well, I don't have access to God's perspective. I don't see what God sees. I don't have the knowledge that God has. So I'm still stuck with my suffering and my pain. You just want me to shut up and worship. That's what they say. I don't see what God sees. Now what do you do with that? How do we respond to that? So to this we say, my dear brothers and sisters, we say to them, sure, you don't see what God sees. You do not have access to Allah's perspective, but you do have access to the divine track record in nature. And this is a really deep point that you want to fully comprehend. Yes, we're not privy to Allah's divine perspective. And thank God for that, because our human brains, I mean, we would have a brain freeze if you could, subhanAllah, somehow see what God sees. I kid around sometimes. Imagine if Google invented glasses, and now when you put on those glasses, you're able to see everything a surgeon sees inside the human body. And if you don't have that kind of precedence, you don't have that training, that data will overwhelm you. Anyway, yes, we don't have access to God's perspective. What we do have access to the divine track record in nature, and that warrants some level of trust. And this is the second response I like to share with you today, and that is divine track record warrants trust. My dear brothers and sisters, if you study the cosmos, you study nature, you come across the facts that this universe is governed by these incredibly precise laws of physics. I'm sure you've heard of E equals mc squared. And in fact, the universe is not just being governed by these laws. Now scientists have discovered over the past few hundred years that nature has something called constants. These are built into the very fabric of nature. So those of you who have ever seen the equation of gravity that Sir Isaac Newton came up with, you will see it will say m1, m2 divided by r squared, and there's a little g in there. What in the world is that g? That is known as the gravitational constant. Nature just gives you that number. Literally. In every calculation, that number has to be constantly plugged in or you can't calculate gravity. So nature has these precise constants, and now scientists tell us if that G was slightly stronger than it is right now, then the universe would have collapsed upon itself when Big Bang occurred. No big stars would have formed, carbon would not have formed. Nature has these precisely calibrated properties to enable life. For instance, inside every atom is the nuclear force. If that nuclear force is stronger by 1%, chemistry does not happen. Life does not take off. No intelligent life is possible. So you look at you look at these nature. You look at the nature of God, and you look at these precisely calibrated ratios and properties, and you can clearly conclude, even if you are not looking at revelation, that whoever is behind this is unbelievably powerful and unbelievably knowledgeable. In fact, one of my favorite arguments for God's existence is what I call the mathematical argument. And the mathematical argument for God's existence, and honestly, if someone is reasonable, they do not need any other argument after this one. It's so powerful. It's so incredible. Like, this is it. It's like in my opinion, it's an ace in the hole. The mathematical argument goes simply like this. Over the last few hundred years, scientists have discovered that nature operates on a mathematical order. Gravity is so well behaved that you can capture it in an equation. We asked the atheists, we're like, okay, on your worldview, there's no God. So in other words, nothing created everything. Everything just came about. If that's true, how did it fall upon a mathematical order? That's insanity. We know right now, for instance, if you listen to Roger Penrose, for instance, he'll tell you, he's a leading cosmologist, that at the subatomic level, you have electrons which act like little magnets. You can capture the strength of that magnetism using an equation. So precise, it's you can go 7 decimals long in precision. Why does nature behave mathematically? We can predict right now, 100 years from now, exactly when sun will rise. Why? Nature is orderly. Right now, SpaceX can predict, their rocket launches down to a millisecond. as to when it's going to land in a particular spot in the cosmos. We can predict moon landing times very, very precisely. How is this possible? Why is nature governed on a mathematical blueprint? Atheists, it's impossible for them to explain this. I'll give you one more fascinating story. How many of you know, quick raise of hands, how many of you know how planet Neptune was discovered? Wow, we have one hand here. None of you went to high school in America, right? I'm kidding. How did planet Neptune got discovered? So hopefully you guys know what the solar system is and everything else, inshallah. So, you know the planet right before Neptune is called? 3, 2, 1. Pop quiz, folks. Nobody knows? The planet right before Neptune is Uranus. Now, this particular planet, in the early part of the 1800s, scientists knew for about 50, 60 years that Uranus has a little wobble, a little reverberation in its orbit. It does not behave according to the laws and the equations that Sir Isaac Newton predicted. So the orbit works, but then there's a little vibration in the orbit. It's an irregular orbit movement. And they knew this for about 60 years. And then in 1845, the famous scientist Leverrier, his name is a French scientist. You know how the French names are. Please excuse me. My qira is not that good in French, right? Leverrier, or something his name was. He sat down without a telescope. This is the part you have to appreciate. He doesn't have access to a telescope. He sits down on his desk with his papers, and he does these complex mathematical calculations. And he says the only reason we have this reverberation in Uranus's orbit is if there's another planet that's exerting a gravitational pull on it. So through mathematical calculations, he predicted, a mathematical prediction, that there must be a planet right next to it somewhere. He called, or he delivered a message, there are no phones at that time, he delivered a message to an observatory in Berlin, gives them exact coordinates to set the telescope at, looking for a new planet. Berlin Observatory puts the telescope at the exact coordinates that were given, and lo and behold, Neptune was discovered. SubhanAllah. Why does nature behave mathematically? It's incredible. It's impossible to explain, except on a theistic worldview, that there must be divine intelligence behind it. Now, folks, I'm sharing all this with you, and there's so much more we can share here, that how, subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, at least from our point of view, you look at how photosynthesis occurs, how the ozone layer protects you, how the Earth's electromagnetic shield deflects their deadly radiations from the sun, how Jupiter is a cosmic shield that you and I have, how water defies so many chemical properties to be life-permitting for you. You look at all these facts, my dear brothers and sisters, and you can conclude, even if you're not someone who reads Quran or believes in the Quran, you can conclude that whoever's behind all of this entire show, must be really powerful and must be really knowledgeable. And here's the third thing you can also conclude. He seems to care. Because how else do you explain photosynthesis and the ozone layer? And the fourth thing you can also conclude, if you think a little deeply, he must be really fair. Now, where do you conclude that from? Because you have a sense of fairness. You have a sense of fairness. Someone, this creator of yours, in this case, who has created the cosmos, has endowed you with the ability to judge fair and unfair. If God forbid he is unfair, why give you the ability to judge fair and unfair in the first place? And because he's given you that ability, this instinct to be able to tell what's reasonable and what's unreasonable and what's moral and versus immoral, because he's endowed you with that ability, that means he must have that ability himself, because you cannot give what you don't have. So what I'm saying is that just by studying nature, you can conclude 4 things about the creator of this nature. One is that he's knowledgeable, powerful, seems to care, and he must be fair, because I have a sense of fairness. Someone put that inside of me. So my creator must have that to the most perfect degree, because you can't give what you don't have. If you understood this, now we come back to the problem of suffering. If suffering is happening in this world, and clearly this suffering is happening under the supervision of this creator, who's once again powerful, knowledgeable, seems to care, and is fair, that means he must have, if this suffering is still happening, he must have a very powerful reason, a very knowledgeable reason, a caring reason, and a fair reason to allow this suffering to unfold, because after all, it's the same being who manufactured this reality is allowing this suffering to occur. There must be a powerful reason. There must be a knowledgeable reason. And that, my dear brothers and sisters, warrants trust. So, divine track record warrants trust in the divine. Because you're not dealing with just anyone. You're dealing with the one who gave you your ability to be fair in the first place. You know how you and I look at suffering, they're like, oh, that's unfair. Where did that ability come from? From God. You can't use the ability God gave you to put him on trial. It's like, you're like, well, you're using the ability of fairness that God gives you, and you're like, God, you're unfair. But then your ability to judge came from him. So you can't use the ability he gives you to put him on trial. Because how can you be more fair than the one who gave you the ability to be fair and unfair in the first place? That's basically the point that we're making. So, if you understood all this, one more thing to add here before we move on to the third point. My dear brothers and sisters, understand one more thing when it comes to our observation of suffering in this world. We know through psychology now that our brains are skewed for negativity. And this is called self-awareness, know thyself. We know that human beings have a negativity bias, which is why negative compliments and negative emotions are far more memorable than positive ones. This is where they tell you in counseling, right, that if you give one criticism, offer 4 compliments to kind of undo the damage, especially in marriage. And if you understood this, my dear brothers and sisters, a lot of us, we often hear just negative things about this world in the news cycle. It's the robbery, it's the murder that will make it to the nightly news cycle. So people end up with a very skewed perspective of how much good and evil there is in the world. What you don't hear are millions and millions of people who are being kind to their neighbors, who are grinding out for their families, who are doing their jobs diligently, because of which our water supply is not contaminated. The lights are on. The electrical grid is functioning. The nuclear plants are not melting. This sort of daily heroism is the rule and not the exception. And I think you guys would agree with me that I think there's more good in this world than evil, because look, if I were to ask you the number of healthy days you've had versus when you're sick, what would you say is a percentage? What would you say is a percentage? 5%? 10%? By and large, I think I speak for everyone, the number of days you're healthy pales in comparison to the number of days you're sick. Similarly, if you look at this world and think about and just observe the number of people who are functional versus people who are impaired, the number of trips you had where you reached your destination safely versus when you got into accidents, or the amount of time that has passed when your arteries are flowing with blood versus when they're clogged, or centuries of volcanoes remaining dormant versus when they're active, or when tectonic plates are doing their thing versus when they actually collide and earthquakes occur. By and large, it seems to be that order and normal goodness is the rule, and evil and suffering is the exception. In fact, a lot of people don't know this. In the 1830s, based on the data we have, 90% of the world was in abject poverty. That number is now down to 10%. But you won't hear that in the nightly news cycle. So what I'm trying to say is that our brains are wired for negativity. And on top of all of that, when you and I look at suffering, we have that negative bias. And when you and I look at nature and we see the incredible track record of the divine, it warrants trust. So you want to make sure that you put your own opinion and observation on trial before you put God on trial. That was the second point that I wanted to make, and that leads me to, inshallah, the third point. My dear brothers and sisters, one of the other reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may permit suffering or allow suffering to go on longer than we expect is because suffering gives, let me start with the fourth one first. Suffering leads to well-being in this world. And this right here is something that I think most of us can attest to, even if I don't give the examples I'm about to give you today. In fact, we as Muslims believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not create pure evil. We as Muslims believe that God does not create pure evil and pure suffering. Rather, as Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah points out, he says everything Allah creates, if it's evil from one angle, it's good from another. And on the cosmic scale of things, the debits and the credits kind of balance out. As for pure evil and suffering, then Allah is exonerated from that. So every suffering that you can imagine, including the existence of shaitan, you can imagine that there's a positive to it, which is, for instance, the test of the believers. And that you and I have something to constantly fight and prove our loyalty to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with. So there are always positives. Just like I like to give the example of a knife. It's either a cooking tool or a killing tool, depending upon the perspective that you have. And my dear brothers and sisters, when you think about the benefits of suffering, I mean, there's so many benefits of suffering. Honestly, one has to kind of categorize. I'll share with you a few. There's a really famous book called Anti-Fragility by Nassim Taleb. I recommend you check it out at your own time. He argues that human beings, we're not fragile. So for instance, an egg, and you put a 50-pound plate on it, it's gonna get crushed. That's a fragile thing, like a wine glass. It cracks at first moment of friction. That's fragile. Human beings are anti-fragile, meaning we get stronger with stressors. The more stress, more suffering we're subjected to, stronger we become and higher we rise to the occasion. In fact, if we weren't subjected to that hardship and suffering, we would actually become weaker. So astronauts in space, because they're not subjected to gravity, their muscles actually become weaker. And we know people who are in the hospitals bedridden. What happens to their bodies? They start to deteriorate. We know people who live in first world countries, and they're not living a very rigorous lifestyle. They're living a very comfortable life. What happens? Their bone density starts to go down. Their testosterone levels start to go down. So suffering has a way of making you strong. That's why Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anh would write to his army generals that make sure that you walk barefoot outside time to time. Bathe under the sun. Maintain your rigor. Don't become soft. Because the physical benefits of suffering are immense. And we know right now, my dear brothers and sisters, good biological evidence we have that people, unless they put themselves in challenging circumstances, there are certain things locked away in their genes that simply would not be unlocked. There are certain genes that only become activated and code for new protein when you are putting yourself in challenging circumstances. Meaning so much of you is locked away unless you're exposed to suffering. Truly, diamonds are formed under pressure. And I tell this to my dad. My dad is, alhamdulillah, in his 60s now. Starting from the age of about 35, and I'm sure the doctors can correct me if I'm wrong on this, starting from the age of about 30 or 35, you lose 1% of muscle mass a year. If you're just chilling, coming home, as a lot of our Desi uncles do, they come home and they're right on Jio TV or Jadoo TV, take your pick, and they're just relaxing with Pakistani politics. There's nothing to relax there, by the way. And they're just watching as their bodies dissolve in their beds. And I'm like, Dad, you gotta do something. Unless you subject yourself to the suffering of working out, because guess what happens? We get weak. And if you listen to Andrew Huberman, recently he had a podcast on willpower and tenacity. Really something to listen to, really beneficial. He talks about something called the AMCC, which is basically anterior mid-cingulate cortex. It's a mouthful. I know you fell asleep by the end of that sentence. I got it. Here we go. AMCC. Basically what he says is that this particular part of your brain, it sits right behind your forehead. AMCC is the seat of willpower and tenacity based on neuroimaging, lesion studies. And he says one thing we have observed in people who live till they're 100, their AMCC is pretty intact. Why is it intact? Because AMCC only responds to what he calls micro and macro sucks in life. So if you enjoy working out, that doesn't activate your AMCC. It's only things that you hate doing, like not eating carbs, for instance. You know what I'm saying? Or like running, for instance. Some people just hate cardio. It's when you force yourself to do micro sucks, does your AMCC activates and gets bigger. And when it gets bigger and stronger, it lasts you well into your senior years. Suffering pays off. It's not altogether bad news. And one of my favorite quotes, I heard this from Joe Rogan. I'm sure he was plagiarizing this from someone. But he says, hard times create hard men. Hard men create soft times. Soft times create soft men. And soft men create hard times. And the right cycle goes on and on. So that's just, what I just shared with you right now are physical benefits of suffering. You could go on about societal benefits of suffering. I'll just give you a glimpse literally because we don't have time. One of the sociologists, Jeanette Benson, she did a survey of 800 regions of the world, and you know what she discovered? Regions that were most severely hit by calamities and natural disasters were the most religious. Like the people of Gaza right now. I mean, subhanAllah, I don't know if you're watching some of these TikToks and reels that are coming out. There are people accepting Islam because they're like, we have never seen such faith at display. Like you and I, like some of our young people, we're losing faith watching their suffering. But these people, their faith has gotten stronger. Because hardship has a way of making you vulnerable and dependent on God. And non-Muslims are watching this. They're like, I want what they have. How are these people standing on the rubble of their home with 3 of their kids who they just did janazah of, and they can still get up and say, Alhamdulillah, to Allah we belong, to whom we return. Where is this faith coming from? Hardships have a way of making you strong. And subhanAllah, I sincerely believe this. If you study the signs of the Day of Judgment, by and large the activity of Mahdi alayhi salam and the revival of this deen and the reestablishment of Khilafah is occurring in Baytul Maqdas. Allah is preparing these people. See, one of the words for suffering in Arabic is fitna. The way Arabs used to use the word fatana is when they would take a piece of metal which has gold and impurities inside of it, and they would expose it to intense heat, until all the impurities would be driven out, and now what you're left with is valuable gold. Human beings to some degree work the same way. You and I are subjected to the hardships of life until our hypocrisy, our impurities, our sins are driven away, leaving behind a refined product like the people of Gaza. And upon their hands, like Allah did at the hands of the companions, Allah grants victory. I tell people, because people understand physical analogies, I'm like, just like your muscles don't grow unless you expose them to resistance and hardship, your soul doesn't grow unless you're exposed to suffering. It's just that, is that one-on-one parallel that you want to wrap your head around. I'll share with you one more example and then we'll move on to some other categories. You know, I watched a documentary called Chernobyl. It's an award-winning documentary about what happened in the 1980s, where one of the nuclear power plants in Chernobyl, which is basically in Ukraine, in Kiev, because of the neglect by the government officials, because of bribery, because of corruption, people turned a blind eye to the maintenance schedule and all sorts of different issues and red tape that was involved. One neglect after another until their gross negligence reached a boiling point, and that entire power plant erupted and melted. Radiation got in the air. Thousands of people died. Now, I'm sharing this with you because if you were to look at that suffering at that point in time, you'd be like, oh my God, why does suffering occur? Why doesn't God stop this? Historians tell us, 20 years later, after they analyze history from that point onwards, historians tell us that one of the reasons why Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire, was brought to its knees is because of what happened at Chernobyl. That meltdown of the power plant triggered the beginning of the meltdown of the Soviet Union itself. You have no idea about the social, political ramifications of a particular suffering. Just like you and I right now, we're looking at Gaza and we're heartbroken and seriously, like there are no words to describe the emotions. And nothing I say, astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah, should imply that it's worth it somehow. La hawla wa la quwwata. We never ask for trials, but when we're hit with trials, we face it with patience. Analysis is not justification, folks. What I am saying is that there's upside here. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not create an evil unless there's an equal khair that will come out of it. And that's what the divine track record shows. Because this powerful, knowledgeable, caring, and fair being will not let any suffering occur unless there's justification for it. And the results and the benefits of suffering go on and on, my dear brothers and sisters. I shared this in my khutbah here with you guys when it comes to, so I shared with you physical benefits of suffering, societal benefits of suffering. There's a whole category of mental and spiritual benefits. I shared with you guys in one of my khutbahs that Google did a study of who their best employees are. And they concluded that their best employees are those young people who overcame a crippling hardship early in life. Khalil Gibran, he says, the greatest characters of human history are seared with scars of hardship. How many of you know who are the greatest 4 women of all time in Islamic tradition? Who would you say is the first on the list? Yell it out for me. Say it again. Abu Bakr, you said? No, I'm talking about amongst the ladies. Amongst the ladies, who are the top, like the cream of the crop? Yes. Asiya, very good. Fatima, Maryam, and Khadija, very good. Thank you very much. Now, there's this intense competition between Asiya and Maryam alayhi salam. Khadija radiallahu anha and Fatima are up there as well. A lot of difference and a lot of debate about who is actually at the top. It's probably Maryam alayhi salam. Anywho, Asiya, who's Asiya? She's the wife of the Pharaoh. Isn't it crazy? I don't know if sometimes we read the story, but we rarely take the time to kind of peel the layers and reflect. Isn't it mind-boggling that the best woman in that Egyptian society, which is Asiya, ends up being married to the worst man? Could have been any Egyptian man. They could have tied the knot. But she ends up, the best ends up with the worst. Insane. But you know what our scholars, they say? They say perhaps we would not know about the greatness of Asiya had it not been for the trial and the suffering of the Pharaoh. What made her great is her transcending that suffering on a day-to-day basis. It's what makes her great. It wasn't a walk in a park. It wasn't a cakewalk that allowed her to reach this mountain of greatness. That's not how she became the GOAT, the greatest of all time. It's through the hardships of life that she endured with patience and perseverance. Hardship is not altogether bad news. Ustad Murphy was sharing with us an example that was so emotional, subhanAllah, it got to me. You know, speaking of mental and spiritual benefits of hardships, Ustad Murphy was saying that there was a critical care doctor that he knew in Chicago. And what happened is that his daughter passed away at the age of 13. Devastated him. And subhanAllah, this was something that he used to say that I can make no sense of this. And he said, I would go from different imams asking them, why did this happen to me? Why would Allah do this to me? And I would never get a satisfying answer. And he's like, I reached a point where I'm like, Ya Allah, I'm just submitting to you. I don't know why this happened to me. I don't know what I did to deserve this. He never reconciled with that fact. Until one day, he was attending one of Ustad Murphy's class. And Ustad Murphy was sharing with him, so Ustad Murphy is working on a book by Al-Is ibn Abd Salam, where he mentions about 22 different benefits of hardship. And I'm sharing some of those with you right now. And one of the benefits of hardship is that it makes you a source of mercy for others. When you go through such deep suffering, the depth of character you have, the empathy you have, the emotional strength you have. I don't know if you've ever been in the presence of someone who had this aura to them. They felt larger than life. Most likely they went through the crazy hard knocks of life. And this doctor, he went through them. So what would happen in his hospital is that they had a special code just for this doctor. If there's someone in critical care if there are parents or there are family members in critical care who are about to lose their children. So there was a special code that they would use just to summon that doctor. And what would happen? Parents are going crazy as that child is about to die, and they would not want to talk to any nurse, any doctor, until this particular doctor would walk in, and he would say, hi, my name is Abdullah. I lost my daughter 13 years ago. And they would crumple in his arms, break down in tears, because he could relate to that pain. And he's like, that didn't occur to me that her death was a mercy upon these families. The depth of mercy, he's like, to realize that her death is a type of mercy upon others, for Allah to make me a source of mercy for others, that's a noble departure. And he kind of came to terms with that. My dear brothers and sisters, if you listen to Bilal Asad, who lost his son in a snow automobile incident, his son died in front of his eyes. He's like, as I'm lowering his body in the grave, I wanted to bash my head on the walls of that grave. It should have been me in there, not my son. Yet he goes on to say, subhanAllah, because of what I've experienced, I changed entirely. Things that used to attract me from this world no longer have any attraction. Because I lost something of such immense value, this world has no pull on me anymore. Like the people of Gaza. Like you and I right now, a lot of people are like, I was planning a vacation, but then Gaza genocide started to occur, and I feel nasty thinking about a plan to Hawaii as my brothers and sisters are dying. As if people of Gaza are liberating us from the shackles of materialism. Bilal Asad says that my son died, and I lost interest in things that would pull me. My relationships with others, I started to value them. They became precious. And my sweetness in the middle of the night to pray went to a whole new level. The vulnerability, the depth of tears, like the strength of character. These things are simply not possible except in the crucible of hardship and suffering. That's what truly matures your soul. That's why when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when the meeting with Musa and Allah finally occurs, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Taha recounts for him all that he went through. إذ تمشي أختك فتقول هل أدلكم على من يكفل فرجعناك إلى أمك كي تقر عينها ولا تحزن وقتلت نفسا فنجيناك من الغم وفتناك فتونا فلبثت سنين في أهل مدين ثم جئت على قدر يا موسى. Allah recounts for him all the trials he went through, how the authorities were after him, how he went from living in a royal palace from riches to rags, how he had to work a minimum job for 10 years, how when he was breaking up a fight, the situation occurred as such that he accidentally ended up killing someone, and now he had to flee for his life, and then 10 years as a shepherd, working for minimum wage. All these trials, Allah, when he finally meets him, he says, you came right on high, Musa. And then Allah recounts for him all that occurs, and then listen to what he says. He says, وَلِتُصْنَعَ عَلَىٰ عَيْنِي. You were being crafted under my eyes. SubhanAllah. I don't know if this hits you. You know, if you've ever seen a carpenter or a craftsman, when they're trying to create an artifact, they have to polish it. How do they polish it? And they'll have a drill, something that will expose it to some heat, to shave off the sides, to make it perfectly rectangular or round, depending upon their purpose. To polish, to shave, requires concentration of energy. Allah is like, Musa, as you were subjected to the hardships of life, you were being crafted and manufactured under my eyes via the mechanism of suffering. It's not altogether bad news. Suffering has so many benefits, my dear brothers and sisters. The gratitude it gives you, the humility, the passion to serve, the appreciation for life. The list goes on and on. Now, a lot of times, an atheist will ask you a question. They will say, well, can't God just give you all these things without hardship and pain? So this question comes up. Well, just make me tough, make me person of depth and character without hardship. To that we say, but what meaning and significance would it have then? It's like, imagine you're at the bottom of Mount Everest and there's a teleportation technology that allows you to teleport from the bottom of the mountain to the top. What meaning does that achievement have? It's only when you push against hardship that you transcend your suffering. Do heroic possibilities open up? If there's no suffering, there are no heroes. Why do we admire heroes? Because they overcome crippling difficulties of life. This is why those NFL players, when they're kissing that trophy, they're crying. Why? Because of the tears and the sweat that represents. It means something. And, you know, Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz and Holocaust, what's he say? He says, what man actually needs is not a tensionless, frictionless state, but rather the striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal. In fact, Carl Jung, he says, the word happy would lose its meaning if it was not balanced by sadness. So, just like light would have no meaning without darkness, similarly, like happiness and fulfillment, all these things are only appreciated in the contrast of difficulty of life. You know, it's really crazy how, subhanAllah, Allah's creation is so consistent. It's just mind-boggling sometimes. I don't know how many of you are into cold showers, but studies show that if you do a cold plunge, your dopamine levels will increase up to 250% above baseline for the rest of the day. So cold showers are being highly, highly recommended right now. All the athletes do it. Your dopamine, like, to give you an idea, like some drugs will boost your dopamine to about 200%, 250% above baseline. Cold showers do that, but in slow dosages, so you don't feel like drunk or high or anything like that. Why am I telling you this? They said the only way to get this dopamine high is if you actually suffered when you did your cold plunge. If you didn't feel that shock and you weren't out of breath, you won't get that increase. You have to suffer to see greatness. This is like built into the very fabric of reality, subhanAllah. And I've heard this from many artists. They say that if their album wasn't so good, when they released the album and it was a flop, they'll say, yeah, my album flopped because I didn't have a heartbreak to work through. That pain, you know, that suffering allows them to access the dungeons of their heart. And those deep meanings that simply would not reveal themselves except in the furnace of hardship. And my dear brothers and sisters, this is where, you know, I often say that we cannot value our pleasure, no matter how intense, if we didn't know pain. And Shaykh Hassan Qadi, he said something really beautiful, speaking of like, why is it that these incredible benefits only come through the road of hardship? Shaykh Hassan Qadi said something really beautiful. He said, look, Allah doesn't love evil. God doesn't like to see you in suffering. But Allah loves the concentrated goodness that can only be generated in the backdrop of evil and suffering. Like, so let me give you an example. Imagine someone imagine you come to learn about someone who never did drugs their entire life. You're like, wow, that's great. Well, that's because they never had access to drugs. Now imagine another person who didn't do drugs their entire life and they were born in the middle of a narcotics ring. Their father is their drug lord. Yet despite accessibility to those drugs, they still stayed away with all that temptation. Your admiration is much greater. Why? There's greater suffering. There's greater temptation. And subhanAllah, we as Muslims, my dear brothers and sisters, you and I, we claim to be Muslims. We submit to Allah. If life was always good, things were always calm and luxurious, when do you ever get tested in your commitment to Allah? You know? Like, you know how they say you're only as strong as your weakest link? Similarly, like imagine someone in the community who's always smiley and calm and composed. But the true test of that person's character or their adab is when they're under pressure, is when they're tested, when someone is rude to them. Now let's see how smiley they are, right? Or for instance, you may have someone who on paper looks like a great surgeon because, you know, all they do all day is just, you know, do stitches or whatever, let's just say, right? It's only when they're in a critical situation where the heart rate is dropping and the blood is pooling. Now we get to really see what they're actually made of. Allah says something similar. أَحَسِبَ النَّاسِ أَن يَقُولُوا آمَنَّا وَهُمْ لَا يُفْتَنُونَ. Do you really think you'll just say, La ilaha illallah, I believe in Allah, I love God? And then a test comes. And then you frizzle. And you flake out. Saad Murphy, he tore his ACL. He said, subhanAllah, if you know anything about tearing up your ACL, recovery is 6 months. And it's painful. They're literally drilling a hole into your bone. It's painful. And now, with that pain, and you have to take painkillers, with that pain you have to get up and still pray Fajr. And you still have to bend and say, Allah, Sami Allahu liman hamida. That submission to Allah is far more valuable, far more greater, far more sincere than if things were always chill. That's what makes people of Gaza so special, is their iman despite their suffering. So in other words, Allah doesn't love suffering. He loves the goodness that can only be generated in the crucible of suffering. So if you understood this, my dear brothers and sisters, allow me to read to you something Ibn Qayyim said. He said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, such a beautiful quote, oh my goodness. He says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expelled his chosen one Adam from paradise, despite having created it for him. Allah's wisdom necessitated that he not enter it permanently except after difficulty and hardship of this world. Therefore he removed him initially only to readmit him later, a more perfect admission. Only Allah knows the disparity between the first entrance and the second entrance. And he says, what great disparity exists between the messenger of Allah being in Makkah under the protection of his tribe and him entering Makkah 20 years later after all that he suffered, and then he enters Makkah on the day of the conquest of Makkah. What great disparity exists between the pleasure and comforts of the believers in paradise after enduring what preceded it, and their pleasure had they just been created inside them and then never had to go through suffering. What great disparity exists between the joy of someone God relieved after affliction, enriched after poverty, guided after being astray, collected their heart after being broken. What great disparity exists between their joy and those who did not taste these bitter pains. What great disparity exists between the pleasure and comfort of the believers in paradise after enduring what preceded it, and their pleasure had they just been created inside of it. As Allah says in the Quran, and perhaps you hate a thing and it's good for you, and perhaps you love a thing and it's bad for you, and Allah knows and you don't. And Allah knows and you don't. And Allah, Wallahu ya'lamu wa antum la ta'lamun, back to the knowledge gap. You're going to have to learn to trust the divine works and the divine words. And my dear brothers and sisters, anyway, the list can go on and on. I'd like to inshallah wrap up here, and if there are any questions, I'll take them. There's a whole section that can be dedicated to the benefits in the hereafter. I will say this much, I've shared this before in my khutbahs, people who suffer in this world will be handsomely rewarded on the Day of Judgment. One narration that's so powerful, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that people who, ahlul bala, people who suffered a lot in this world, gut-wrenching pains, they'll be brought on the day of judgment and will be given such a royal reception by God that people of afiyah, we ask for afiyah, yeah? People of afiyah in this world, they will go to Allah and say, Ya Allah, can you send us back into this world so we were skin alive bil maqarid, with scissors. So so we can come back to you right now and get the same treatment they're getting. So people of hardship won't be complaining tomorrow. That's for a fact. In fact, we're told in a narration that when the scales are established for people so the accounting can start, for Ahlul Bala, there are no mizans. Allah will be too shy of establishing mizans for them. So if you're suffering here, you'll be hooked up there. And for sure, you won't be complaining. In fact, you would want to come and suffer again just so you can go back. Just like the shuhada, Allah will ask them, when they see the delights that Allah has in store for them, they're like, Allah will say, Atashtahun, do you want something else? They say, Ya Allah, send us back to the war zone. We want to die again. The sweetness of dying for you. The sweetness of suffering for you. Or ulama, they say there's one pleasure that doesn't exist even in Jannah. And that is a pleasure of sacrificing for Allah. Suffering for Allah. And still getting up and praying. And making dua. And being committed. That's beautiful. That's heroic. And there's so many narrations on this front. The Prophet ﷺ said, Man mata maridan, mata shahidan. If you died because of a disease, you died as a martyr. The Prophet ﷺ says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at someone who's bedridden and he commands the angels to write down all the good deeds this person used to be able to do before they were bedridden. And when that person is healed and they were patient for Allah's sake, all their past sins are forgiven. If someone lost a loved one, the Prophet says that Allah says, مَا لِعَبْدِ الْمُؤْمِنِ عِنْدِي جَزَاء. I simply have no way of rewarding a person who lost his loved one. Many of us lost loved one during COVID. If you lost a loved one, Allah says, I have no way of rewarding a person whose beloved I took from him in this world and he remained patient for my sake. No way of rewarding them except the Jannah. A mother who lost a child, a miscarriage, that child will come in front of Allah with an umbilical cord of his and will say, Ya Allah, we were separated in this world, do not separate us today. And yuragimu, he will aggressively argue in front of Allah until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give the verdict, take your parents by the hand and walk them in paradise. This is important for us to know, because one of the reasons why atheists lose their mind when it comes to the problem of suffering is because all they got is this world. So they have what we call a maximalist posture towards this world. All the pleasure has to happen here. All the pain has to be minimized here. And if there's no pleasure here, if you lost out on pleasure, you lost ultimately. It's an irreconcilable loss. And pain here is a permanent pain. So there's no reason to remain disciplined. There's no reason to persevere. That's why rates of suicide are so high amongst atheists. Go to Switzerland now. They give you an option, because it's a pretty atheistic country. PAS, physician-assisted suicide. One of the options on the table, if you're in a lot of pain, subtly they'll suggest, well, there are ways to kind of bring that pain to an end permanently. Of course, it's your decision. It's only consent-based. But they're subtly suggesting that a physician can help you die. Because, it'll save the healthcare a lot of money. If this guy can just take an early exit, tap out a little early. Nasallallahu afiyah. That's what's happening. Alhamdulillah for deen and iman, where our suffering is not in vain. Your pain is not in vain. There's a purpose in your suffering, meaning in your sorrow. And that goes through and through, because we have hereafter on the other side, where every suffering here will be redeemed there. You will get your paycheck. And when you show up on the Day of Judgment, you would have hoped that there was more suffering, not less. So, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He gives us the clarity and the contentment and the calmness of the heart when it comes to this particular issue. I hope I said a few things that hopefully it cleared up the fog for you. And I hope inshallah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to tawaffani musliman wa alhiqni bis salihin, that we die in the state of submission and that we meet with the righteous on the Day of Judgment. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ya muqallib al-qulub, thabbit qulubana ala dini. O you, the changer of hearts, keep our hearts firm on our deen. Allah grant us the ability to give you benefit of the doubt. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Salamun ala al-mursaleen. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.